going to hit record. Okay, so we're recording. Okay. Hit share my screen. Let's see. For some reason, share the contents of your screen. For some reason, it's not. Not letting me share my screen. I think I'm going to cancel the live transcription for the moment and see if that window. Here we go. Okay. Can people see my screen now? Yep.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, but the problem is now I can't see the live transcription. So I'm going to enable the live transcription.
It looks like it's on. It looks like it's on.
Okay, but now it's saying stop after, it's asking me to stop the cloud recording and I don't want to do that. Okay. So when I hit the transcribe, it doesn't allow me to share my screen for some reason. Entire screen, let me, no, it doesn't work. Window, oh, here we go. Okay, sorry about that. Can you see now the slides?
Yes.
Well,
Okay.
yep, okay. So welcome to the third office hour, module 4 on transnational corruption. Any questions right now or comments on anything? You should have, I also put on the assignment 1, I put on the canvas so that you can all see that. And so tonight we'll talk about transnational corruption, looking first at the US law, both the criminal aspects and the accounting provisions. Then we'll look at some of the international aspects of transnational corruption. And then finally, we will consider its applicability to developing countries. And for many years, the US was way ahead of the world because of the fact that the US enacted the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977. It was quite frustrating for US businesses because their competitors were able to, their competitors were able to get a lot of contracts that they weren't because they were able to pay bribes. But finally, with the international conventions in the mid 1990s, other countries started enacting their own laws prohibiting foreign bribery, and countries started to enforce the anti-bribery laws, and then international organizations jumped into the game. And so why is anti-corruption important? Anybody want to guess? Well, pervasive and uncontrolled corruption thwarts economic development. It undermines political legitimacy. And even less pervasive corruption ends up in wasted resources. It greatly increases the price of, whether you're building a bridge or a highway. If you've got to pay 10 or 15% bribes in order to do the deal, it increases unnecessarily the cost. And it also deprives a government of revenues. It distorts economic decision-making, and it imposes negative externalities on a country. So in terms of the US, first we'll look at the criminal provisions of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And the essential elements are that it criminalizes a payment, offer, or promise of anything of value to any foreign official, foreign political party, or party official or candidate for political office, or other person, knowing that all or part of the payment or promise to pay will be passed on to any one of those people. And as we know, it's not normal that the bribe is paid directly. It's usually paid to someone who calls himself a consultant, or a marketer, or sometimes it's paid to the brother or the wife, or maybe the friend, maybe the mother-in-law. It's paid to all kinds of individuals. Now, so in terms of, and it also has to be paid in order to, with a corrupt intent, and to obtain or retain business. So corrupt intent means for the purpose of influencing an official act or decision, or to induce a person to do or not to do any act in violation of his or her normal duty, or inducing the person to use his or her influence with a government, with a foreign government, or to affect or influence a decision. Now, in terms of jurisdiction, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act applies to domestic concerns, which means a US corporation, or it applies to issuers. So any foreign company that is on one of the US exchanges. It also applies to any person, including foreign individuals and entities, that act in furtherance of the improper inducement while on US territory. So for instance, I had a case once where the acting on foreign territory was the CEO in the Netherlands, who participated in a phone call. There was actually 2 phone calls about a bribe in Panama. And just participating in the call meant he was using US wires, and therefore the US prosecuted him. So the US extends its extraterritorial principle very robustly. It also can mean any it can mean any US national can be liable. So now, and it's a payment or an offer or a promise can be, all of those, if everything else is present, is sufficient. There's also no de minimis, so anything of value. So I once had a multinational enterprise call me saying they were going in 2 days to Hungary, and they already had a contract with the Hungarian government. They had a meeting with, some officials, and they hoped to get the contract extended. They were going to bring White House pens as a gift to the officials. Now, White House pen probably had a, I don't know, $10, $15, $20 value. Would that be potentially a crime under the FCPA?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I wasn't, what I did was I sent an email to Transparency International in Hungary and said, first of all, my client tells me it's customary to bring a little gift. And is that right? And they said, no, they didn't think it was customary. Now, what if the pen had the name of the company on it? Would that be okay?
No,
As we'll see, that could be, I'm sorry, go ahead.
that would still be, it still has value.
It would still have value, but it could potentially be considered a bona fide business expense because it was marketing. It's a gray area. It's a gray area. And as we'll see, I mean, the Department of Justice is probably, they're not going to prosecute somebody over that, but they might prosecute them for that in addition to a whole host of other things. And by the way, the Department of Justice has put out about a 200-page guide. I think it's about a year or so old. It's the Department of Justice guidance on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I mean, it's a great resource. It's easily available. Just type in Department of Justice FCPA resource guide, and it goes chapter and verse into all these things. You've got to do it to obtain or retain business, but that's been very broadly interpreted. So that can mean you want the government to circumvent quotas or to bypass licensing requirements or to reduce the proposed taxes or to reduce the penalties. So a lot of times a multinational enterprise will get audited and they'll be told it could be worth millions of dollars, but somebody will whisper in their ear, if you want the audit to go away, just slip so many thousands of dollars to individual X and your audit's going to go away. In fact, I had a case once where my client said they had done that, but now it has come to the attention of their US parent. This was they were doing business in the Philippines through their sub, and what could they do? And I said, well, you've got big problems, buddy, because they're going to have to do an internal investigation. They're going to have to discipline you. They're probably going to can your ass. And so that's very broadly interpreted what obtaining or retaining business means. So there are exceptions and affirmative defenses. One of the exceptions is facilitating, expediting, or grease payments are okay. Now, and it's important to know that since foreign governments have enacted their own anti-bribery, transnational corruption acts. Some of them, like the UK Bribery Act, doesn't have this exception, facilitating payments. So in the US FCPA, it's limited to payments to expedite or secure performance of routine governmental action. So if there's some discretion, that's not a facilitating payment. So what about your, let's say you've got a new business and your utilities are, they're going to be put in, your phone lines and your sewage, but you're told, well, the ministry has very limited resources and it's going to take 2 months, but maybe, you know, with an extra payment, with a little payment, we can expedite it. Is that okay?
Yes,
Anyone want to venture a guess?
yes,
That should be okay because that's a routine matter. I mean, you have, you know, a right to get these utilities, and so that should be okay. The problem with facilitating payments, and some businesses just say, you know, even though it's okay, we prohibit them, or we only allow them if it's approved by, you know, our general counsel or our vice president. And that's because facilitating payments are a slippery slope. Once a host government starts getting facilitating payments, they might try to get more payments, and it might not be just a facilitating payment anymore. Also, there's an exception for reasonable and bona fide expenditures that are directly related to the promotion, demonstration, or explanation of products or services, or to the execution or performance of a contract with a foreign government agency. And that also, it has to be lawful under the laws of the host country. So for instance, if you want to bring a foreign official to your factory in, you know, the US to look at the jet plane that you're trying to sell, or maybe it's a high tech, you know, some computers, you can, you know, you can bring them, but it should be economy class. They shouldn't be diverted to, you know, Disney World with their family for a week on their way, et cetera, et cetera. So also, a business can raise affirmative defense under anti-bribery provisions for payments or offers that are lawful under the written laws and regs of the country in which the bribe occurs. But I can tell you that very few, if any, countries allow bribes. Maybe they might allow facilitating payments. There's also a procedure where you can get an opinion from the Department of Justice if you're not sure about a gray area. It usually takes anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks to get a response, sometimes a little bit less. And because it takes so long, a lot of companies say, let's not bother. And also it may be sent back because you didn't outline your facts well enough. Statute of limitation is 5 years with the possibility of requesting tolling for 3 years if the prosecutor can say, look, he needs more time because there's a lot of foreign evidence that he or she can't obtain. There's accounting and record keeping provisions. They apply only to issuers. So those are people on the stock exchange. And, you know, officers, directors, employees, and stockholders or agents of the issuer are subject to the accounting provisions. And so you've got to keep accurate records, and that's, you know, to prevent off the book transactions. So, and even companies that aren't issuers, they still have to, they still can't keep false books and records. So I was retained once by a Texas firm that was doing business. It was in the oil industry in Mexico, and they had some irregular payments, and they wanted to know, did they have to make a voluntary disclosure? So, we did some internal investigation. We interrogated the people in Mexico. And in the end, I said, well, your books and records were really good because you caught these irregularities within a few weeks. And we've done this very comprehensive internal investigation. It doesn't look like the irregular payments went to the Mexican government official. And therefore, it's a gray area whether you need to do a voluntary disclosure because it looks like your books and records worked, and because I don't see that there was a bribe. You can or can't, depending on what you want to do. You don't necessarily have to. So in the text, there's a discussion on page 122 of the Siemens anti-corruption case. This was one of the first huge cases because Siemens is a huge company. And what was happening was in Germany, they were under audit, and then suddenly the German government saw all these irregularities. And as a result, Germany and Siemens notified the US. They conducted a very large internal investigation. They discovered 1.36 billion in payments, of which 805 million were corrupt payments. They had to enter into a deferred prosecution agreement joint with Germany. They paid 1.6 billion in penalties. There were a couple of big Wall Street law firms involved. One of the second ones was Debevoise. They billed 1.5 million just doing the internal investigation. Since that case, there have been a whole series of deferred prosecution agreements with a number of other countries. So you get credit for the amount that you have to pay to the other countries. The Department of Justice will give you, credit for that. So there's something called vicarious liability. So an individual or entity can suffer vicarious liability for the conduct of a third party when the third party is acting for or on behalf of the entity or the individual. So that can be a consultant, that can be a marketing individual. So to give you an example, I had a small defense contractor client who was recently going to have one of their contractors take out to lunch some generals in the Ukraine military. They're trying to get a contract in Ukraine, which, there's a lot of potential military business right now. And they wanted to know, was it okay to take a few generals out to dinner? And so I said, well, do you have a FCPA or an anti-corruption due diligence program? If so, let me see it. No, they didn't. So then I said, well, one thing is, if you do it, you should probably only do it once. It shouldn't be like a splurge. You should only take the generals, not their spouses. And let me know if there's any follow-up, because usually when you're trying to get business, one meal ain't gonna do it. You need to do, more things. And I said, and by the way, one thing that we need is we need to closely follow Ukrainian law. So, and by the way, I don't practice Ukrainian law. I'm not licensed to practice in Ukraine. And although I've read a very good summary, a very detailed summary of Ukrainian law, I think there might be some problems. So, I gave them a Ukrainian lawyer who had written a very good, like 5-page summary of Ukrainian anti-corruption law. And she started asking some of the same questions I did. And thank God the defense contractor said, okay, this is off, we don't want to, violate the law. And, I said, you can't just start inserting, provisions when you don't have already an anti-corruption due diligence plan. If you do, you're going to have problems. So, the next question was, okay, how much is it going to cost to do an anti-corruption due diligence plan? So what do you do to prevent vicarious liability if you're going to use a consultant or an agent overseas? Because a lot of times you ain't going to get a contract. You're not going to get business unless you've got, a consultant or an agent in that country and, snooping around, telling you when there's a bid or when there's potential to get new business, and, doing other things to promote your company. And so one of the things you have to do is conduct an investigation of any potential agent or consultant, and make sure you're hiring that person because of their substantive knowledge. You're not hiring them just because they're the brother of the minister or the sister-in-law of the minister. And, you can conduct some investigation online, but in some cases, depending on the country, you may want to hire a forensic consultant, a forensic investigator, I should say. There are many of them that, have an office or have contacts in that country, so that you also can see that, yes, this potential agent or consultant seems to have, good pedigree, good experience, and that person is not being hired just because of their relationship with the potential government ministry with whom you're trying to procure a contract. You also have to comply with local and international law. So as we'll see, there are now foreign laws, such as maybe the UK Bribery Act applies. And if the UK Bribery Act prohibits facilitation payments, then even though the FCPA allows it, you can't do it. You also have to take into consideration the various international anti-corruption conventions, which we're going to get into very soon. You should put in your contract with that consultant very strict provisions setting forth that they've got to acknowledge the elements and the requirements of the FCPA, and they agree to adhere to it. You've got to, tell them they can't spend money, or they can't spend more than, a very small amount without prior approval and without getting a receipt and, putting it through your system. You should give regular training to that agent or consultant marketer. And there should be monitoring and auditing. So I just recently had a client a non-governmental organization doing business in an East African country, and they got a potential whistleblower that said, they saw that there were a lot of irregularities in the office of the NGO in that East African country. And so, they said, what should they do? Well, I said, well, the email isn't detailed enough to know if this is real. So, you've got to go back and ask the person for more details about the alleged irregularity so that you can know whether you should do an internal investigation. But, the person said, well, they weren't willing to do that. They're going to get fired, blah, 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 blah. And, the client basically had to say, well, without more information, we can't even do an internal investigation. You got to give us some facts to know if this is real or this is bogus. And I said, by the way, do you guys have an FCPA plan? No. So even NGOs that are doing international business have got to have an anti-corruption due diligence program, or else they could, if anything goes wrong, they could be liable, and they could, suffer criminal or financial penalties. There should also be provisions in the contract for allowing the company to do all kinds of intrusive investigations with respect to any suspicious activity or irregularity, and should make the agent or consultant cooperate and be subject also to suspension or firing. Also on December 6th, the White House issued the first ever U.S. strategy on countering corruption. I put in the announcement a small article about it, showing that, okay, the Biden administration is going to try to coordinate better, have a whole of government approach to anti-corruption. There are a lot of elements about curbing illicit finance, including the new anti-money laundering, the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020 and the Corporate Transparency Act. The Biden administration also has said it would issue new regulations relating to real estate, and would have better accountabilities for corrupt actors, would support would also support investigative journalists, would establish a kleptocracy asset recovery rewards program that will enhance the U.S. government's ability to find kleptocrat assets in the U.S. And by the way, the U.S. now has had for a number of years a kleptocracy assets unit in the Department of Justice, and that unit institutes on its own investigations and will forfeit assets and return them to the country from which they came. And also part of the strategy is to have more diplomatic engagements and foreign assistance. So for instance, I'm on March 25th doing a workshop with Surinamese officials. Suriname has had a lot of corruption problems lately, and the U.S. Embassy in Suriname is in part sponsoring and subsidizing the workshop. So any questions or comments here? Okay, so let's then talk about international anti-bribery initiatives. So there's a whole host of international agreements on anti-corruption. And before I should have also mentioned, should have called attention to the whistleblower provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act, which allows whistleblowers to obtain between 10 and 30% of any monetary sanctions over $1 million. There have been some really big rewards. That has meant that now if you're a multinational enterprise and there's some kind of irregularity, you've got to quickly investigate, and you don't want the whistleblower to beat you to the Department of Justice, because otherwise you could be in for a large penalty. So, and the Dodd-Frank Act also has provisions for resource extraction issuers, but during the Trump administration, the regulations were basically frozen. So Biden administration has promised to restart those extractive industry provisions that require US multinationals to report their payments to foreign governments when they're conducting extraction of natural resources. So the OECD Convention of 1997 is important. It also does not provide for a de minimis amount when there's a bribe involved. It also involves foreign officials, and it also, the intent and knowledge is not so clear in the OECD provision. And it's not so clear whether there's vicarious liability for payments by third parties in cases of willful blindness. But there is international cooperation, and there's a requirement for corporate criminal responsibility. The penalties must be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. So I had to go some years ago to Chile. Chile was wanting to be in the OECD, and the OECD said, look, if you want to join our organization, then you've got to follow our rules. You've got to join the OECD anti-corruption conventions, and you've got to enact legislation that effectively implements it. So in Chile, they didn't have criminal responsibility. So I had to go there and talk in Spanish on the US criminal sanctions. And so they then, crafted their own regulations, just like Brazil has done, which they both have harsh penalties, and they also they mitigate the penalties if there's a good due diligence program, and if the company does a thorough internal investigation when there's any indication of improprieties, and when those companies make a voluntary disclosure to the law enforcement authorities. So the OECD convention has very broad requirements for international cooperation, and very important, there's a self and mutual evaluation by a working group on bribery. Those evaluations are public because they were made public Britain did not have good anti-bribery laws, but after the second evaluation, non-governmental organizations really lobbied hard, and the UK then agreed and passed the UK Bribery Act. So that's an example of the combination of the mutual evaluation mechanism in the OECD convention plus the work of NGOs. So the OECD only targets active bribery on the offering side. It doesn't target the demand, or it doesn't cover private sector bribery. There is also the OAS convention. And by the way, sometimes one of the questions on your final exam might be, you are tasked by the new Attorney General of a developing country who wants your advice on how that country can prevent white collar crime and how that country can recover assets, etc. And so this is where you should be aware of all the international and regional conventions. So the OAS convention applies in the Western Hemisphere. Unlike the OECD convention, it targets passive bribery. It also requires the criminalization of illicit enrichment. And the US has reserved on this provision. The US is a member, but the US says, look, we can't do illicit enrichment because of the presumption of innocence in criminal cases. And Canada did the same thing. So there's also a monitoring mechanism in the Inter-American Convention, but it's not nearly as successful as the Working Group on Bribery in the OECD. The OAS also has done model laws. So one of the model laws is on the declaration of assets by political officials, by public officials. There's also 2 Council of Europe conventions that are very broad. And those have a pretty broad membership. The US doesn't participate. I don't believe in those conventions, especially the civil law one. There's also the UN Convention against corruption, and the UN Convention is very important because there's over, I think, 140, 150 signatories. So it's almost universal. It's also very broad. It focuses on both the public and the private sector. It requires signatories to criminalize derivative crimes to corruption and to take preventive obligations. In other words, the signatories are supposed to enact legislation to require the public to require both the public sector, things like procurement law, and the private sector to implement due diligence provisions to prevent corruption from happening. In addition, the parties are supposed to criminalize both active and passive bribery, embezzlement of public funds, laundering the proceeds of crime, obstruction of justice, and they can consider criminalizing trading in influence, illicit enrichment, private sector or commercial bribery, and so forth. Now, some of these conventions also require countries to allow victims to sue. So if you represent, let's say, a US enterprise, and the US enterprise lost a contract in a country and thinks they lost the contract because of a bribe or because of a collusive bid, then that your enterprise is allowed to sue to recover for the lost contract. Now, how would it do that? How would it know? It might hire a forensic investigator. It might, get wind from a whistleblower, or it might, read some report of an investigative reporter saying that, they have reason to believe that the prime minister got a bribe, but I mean, he didn't get it directly, but his mother-in-law got it, and she then, bought a brand new house on the beach, and it's really for the prime minister, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, I was recently a consultant and an expert witness in a case, a corruption case in California involving a former president of a Latin American country. That's an example of one of these cases. So the UN convention can be used for asset recovery. It provides that countries should consider engaging in joint investigations, and you can use it to gather evidence or to request extradition. There's a conference of state parties once every, I think, 4 or 5 years that meets and considers all kinds of trends in all kinds of ways to consider improving the convention. And the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crimes, called the UNODC, it also provides technical assistance. So in your readings, there is a discussion of the World Bank stopping Chad. Basically, the World Bank gave a loan to Chad in 2006, and Paul Wolfowitz, the World Bank president at the time, he suspended all of the aid from the World Bank to Chad because Chad was supposed to put its loans for oil revenue in a fund in London for poverty reduction. And the Chad president decided not to do that anymore. And so the World Bank suspended its loan. There's also on page 138 in the notes a discussion of how 138, that's not right. Well, it's on another page, but there's a discussion of a case. Oh yeah, it's on page 160 actually, where a Transparency International in France called Sherpa filed a complaint as a civil party petitioner against 3 African presidents. It was basically, they filed a criminal complaint. And in some civil law countries like France, civilians have a right to plead And in that case, the prosecutors dismissed part of the complaint and the NGOs appealed and they won. And then they basically, they especially went after Equatorial Guinea. The vice president of Equatorial Guinea had mansions, he had a disco, he had, 4 or 5 Mercedes and all kinds of, very expensive, luxurious automobiles. And eventually Equatorial Guinea took the case to the International Court of Justice. They won part, but they lost part. In the end, Teodoro Obiang, the vice president of Equatorial Guinea, was held liable for basically corruption-based laundering. And so that case shows the how important NGOs can be in this anti-corruption battle. In fact, I'm a member of it's not really an organization, it's a network. It's called the Anti-Corruption Alliance Network. I believe it's called ACAN. And they meet once every 2 months. It's got about 140 organizations. And they, talk about trends. They talk about supporting different movements. And in the last 5 or 10 years, developing countries have started really being more proactive in tackling corruption. So for instance, Angola has been very robust in going after the son and the daughter of the former president for about 30 years. And so now you're seeing the whole world, including, as we'll see later on, the World Bank group has been very proactive in this battle. Interestingly, Transparency International was started in the late 80s, early 90s by Peter Eigen, who said, he was a World Bank official, and he said, look, the World Bank is part of the problem. I quit. I'm starting Transparency International. And so, that's how Transparency was started. Later on, the World Bank, as we'll see, did get into the business of trying to stop corruption. So let me pause here and see if there are any comments or questions on anything. Covered a lot of ground very quickly. So yeah, one of the interesting cases on page 154 has to do with Lesotho. What happened was an official in Lesotho thought that he saw bribes in a dam construction, and nobody thought that Lesotho, this prosecutor, was going to be able to successfully prosecute this big multinational, but the official made international evidence requests to Switzerland, and lo and behold, Switzerland came through with a lot of evidence, and the prosecutor successfully prosecuted several multinational enterprises for making bribes. So there are also all kinds of now courses on anti-corruption. So the American University Washington College of Law has a short summer program. I think it's about 6 weeks on all kinds of transnational corruption. If anybody's interested, I can give them more information. Also, there is an international anti-corruption academy in Austria. I've taught there before, although I taught at the World Bank. They held their course at the World Bank. And now I supervise on a regular basis master's theses by students at the International Anti-Corruption Program. They have 3 different master's programs. You also have now NGOs like the Basel Institute on Governance in Basel, Switzerland. It has 3 or 4 anti-corruption programs. Some are designed for asset recovery. They send people to ministries of justice that have corruption cases, like they've had a person in Mozambique and in Peru. They also have a program on green corruption, that is corruption relating to extraction of natural resources and the environment. And so the bottom line is there are now all kinds of programs on anti-corruption, I mean academic programs, and really law firms started getting into white collar crime first because of the FCPA. So a lot of big law firms first started to have an anti-corruption unit because they saw that a lot of their clients had a need to have more robust due diligence programs, and also from time to time to conduct internal investigations when there were irregularities, and also from time to time they had criminal issues. And so a lot of big law firms started with anti-corruption, and then it spread to other issues and became white collar departments. I've seen the same around the world, including now you have boutiques that in places like Brazil that specialize in anti-corruption. So it's a very dynamic and rich field, and you increasingly see cases coming from foreign governments or from the World Bank. So, I mean, for instance, I was involved in a case where an Indian law firm was disciplined by the World Bank, and as a result, they decided finally to develop a anti-corruption due diligence program. So I got involved in, helping them do that. So let me stop there, and let me again entertain any questions or comments from anyone. No? Okay. So if not, oh, wait a minute. I see 2 chat. A lot of risk for the government and foreign. Yep, that's Ms. Cook is certainly right about that. So let me then stop here and then see you all on Thursday. I will. I've recorded this, and hopefully I will be able to post it to your Canvas. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.